Tim, you are a graduate of Warren High School.
I am. Guilty.
Talk about a little bit about your mom and dad. Were they born here? Were they part of this world?
Yes, as a matter of fact, my mother is Warren High, class of 43. My father was born in Warren, but actually moved away to Johnsonburg and went to high school there. And actually kind of fibbed about his age in 1941 after Pearl Harbor and joined the Marines at age 16, as so many of that amazing generation did.
We'll get back to that in just a second. Warren High School, 1972, what was on your playlist? If you had an iPod then, 1972, what do you recall of the music?
Wow. Some really bad 70s schlock rock. Let's see. Help me, guys. Chicago would have been big in 72. I was a big fan of Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, and that was sort of their garden days. It was really just a lot of bad. The 60s were a great era in music, 70s not so much. The stuff that comes on the oldies radio and you wince when your parents turn it up loud, that was 1972 music. Yeah.
Your dad was a member of the Greatest Generation, Thomas Brokaw, who actually wrote in your book. Did that influence you in your interest in writing about your dad's generation or knowing more about that?
Yes, it certainly was part of it. I also am the nephew of Dr. William Cashman, who passed away a while ago, but he was a great historian, both nationally and Warren County historian, and he had an amazing story on Pearl Harbor. He was actually on December 7th, 1941, the day of Pearl Harbor, was driving to Harrisburg to sort of sign up for the Navy Reserves. He was a surgeon, and there was such crying need for surgeons at that point. Even though the U.S. wasn't in the war, it was clear that we were going to be very soon. He heard on the radio that the Japanese had attacked our naval fleet in Hawaii, and he just signed up when he got to Harrisburg for the Navy, and his family didn't see him again for 2.5 years.
And I want to say that's unusual, but it's not that unusual.
It wasn't. The whole, the sacrifice and the incredible difficulties they endured on our behalf. The whole thing is amazing. I think it was 8 days after he signed up for naval duty, he was on a destroyer in the North Atlantic heading toward Nova Scotia.
In the process of your last two books, by the way, the first two were baseball-related books, and I'd love to talk to you more about that, but since we're on this subject, Assignment to Hell, where you focused in on the coverage of the war against the Nazis in Europe, and you cover people like Walter Cronkite and Andy Rooney, people who I know well, but they may not.
Right.
You're in five people you focused in on. Could you give just a brief Reader's Digest of who those five are?
Well, let me just ask for a quick show of hands. Are you guys familiar with Walter Cronkite? Do you know? Well, it's remarkable, isn't it? Walter Cronkite was probably the most formative influence of our generation. He was the CBS News anchorman at a time when almost everybody watched the evening news, and he was there for decade after decade, and there through all the great traumas of the 60s and the things that really tested us back then, the Kennedy assassination, the space program, Vietnam. In fact, it was his position on Vietnam. He came out against it editorially quite strongly, against our involvement in Vietnam in 1968. And that is what turned the tide, really, of public opinion against the war. There's a famous story that President Lyndon Johnson in the White House watched Cronkite deliver that editorial commentary against our involvement in Vietnam, turned the television off and turned to his aides and said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost America." That's how powerful he was back then. But he always saw himself as a World War II correspondent, a print journalist who kind of fell into broadcasting. So in World War II, in the 1940s, he was a very celebrated print journalist in Europe, covering the our bombing campaign against Nazi Germany, and then later, after D-Day, the great sweep across Northern Europe and into Germany. Just an amazing guy. His colleague for many years at CBS News was Andy Rooney. Now, do you guys recognize Andy Rooney? Anybody remember the 60 Minutes, the old guy in 60 Minutes who was so funny? He was a young guy at one point in his life and was kind of a failed Army artilleryman. Got very lucky. A kindly lieutenant said to him one day, you know, you're not much of a soldier, Rooney, but there's this new thing called Stars and Stripes. They were going to restart the great newspaper from World War I that had been so successful, not only in reaching soldiers, but reaching folks back home. Andy Rooney got very fortunate and ended up being in London, like Cronkite, covering the air war against Nazi Germany, early part of the war. Then he covered Normandy right after D-Day. He actually landed on Utah Beach with a Jeep that he had personally equipped, and he used that Jeep to go across France, Belgium, and all the rest on into Germany, and went on to become a very successful writer at both CBS News and CBS Entertainment Broadcast, and then fairly late in life joined 60 Minutes. The other three guys I wrote about in Assignment to Hell are A.J. Liebling, who was a great essayist for The New Yorker. Anybody enjoy reading sophisticated writing? If you do, please do yourself a favor. There are any number of collections of A.J. Liebling's writings, just fabulous, at The New Yorker for many years. And then Hal Boyle, who was an Associated Press columnist, second only to the great Ernie Pyle in terms of popularity during World War II. Just an amazing guy. And then the fifth and final guy I wrote about in Assignment to Hell is Homer Biggert. Homer Biggert was kind of a cub reporter for the New York Herald Tribune in the late 30s and 40s, got very fortunate, got the overseas assignment he wanted in covering the war in Europe, and then went on to become probably the greatest print journalist of his generation, covered all the hot spots after World War II. And there was a wonderful picture I got from Chip Cronkite, Walter's son, Walter III, sent me a wonderful photograph that his dad cherished. It was of Homer Biggert and Walter Cronkite in front of a Army Air Force barracks in Molesworth, England, taken in February of 1943, just before the two of them went on the bombing mission over Germany. That is what sort of I began Assignment to Hell with, and that's where the expression Assignment to Hell comes from. When they got back and both had survived the mission, Homer turned to Walter and said, Walter, have you thought through kind of a lead paragraph? And he said, you know, Homer, I think I'm going to say, I just returned from an assignment to hell, a hell of bursting bombs and smoking aircraft and all this wonderful purple prose. And Homer Biggert, who prided himself on his tight, taut writing, looked at Walter and said, oh, Cronkite, you wouldn't. But Cronkite did. It's what made Cronkite quite famous in the European theater, and I love that expression so much that that's what I call the book.
These five people you profiled really were interested in going to where the action was, as opposed to, I suspect, the prior World War I coverage was they'd be sitting someplace in a hotel getting reports that were filtered. So the idea of infiltration embedment, which wasn't a term then, but
right.
Did that start really with this breed of journalism?
It did, and especially journalists like Hal Boyle and Homer Biggert, who believed in covering war from the cannon's mouth. The first casualty of war is, does anybody know this expression? The first casualty of war is truth. And the World War I generation, and before them, the Spanish-American journalists, Spanish-American war journalists, did not get to the front lines and did not report anything close to the truth. Cronkite, Boyle, Biggert, the other guys I wrote about in Assignment to Hell, believed in really getting in there in the trenches. And even though their work, their articles had to be censored, and the censorship, especially early on, was extremely strict, they really did a very good job of giving people back home a sense of what not only the infantrymen were up against in the European theater, but those amazing bomber boys.
So, but there was censorship, so they couldn't just simply free flow. How did that work? So they would write up a report, then what?
Believe it or not, early on in the war, when we really did not have a land presence in the European theater, and just about everything revolved around the air war, the bombing campaign against Nazi Germany, they would have to go to a special room at the University of London where a censor, usually a Brit, sometimes an American, but usually a Brit, would hang over their shoulder as they composed their story at the typewriter. That's how rigorous censorship was early on. It loosened up when we began gaining traction against Hitler and Nazi Germany, but it still was very, very tight. Homer Biggert was a genius at sort of outflanking the censors, and the censors sort of toward the middle of the war tended to be young kids who really didn't want to continue censoring late into the evening, and Homer Biggert would sort of do a war of attrition. He'd wait them out. They would finally get impatient and just okay his material, which is why so much of Biggert's stuff is more detailed and more specific. The whole philosophy with censorship was we could not allow reporters to put anything in the newspaper or on the wire services that might give the enemy even the vaguest sense of what the next move would be. So they couldn't, especially early in the war, if a certain bombing mission had gone poorly, or if a certain invasion or raid didn't go poorly, they couldn't accurately report that. They could hint at it, and Hal Boyle was a genius at hinting at it. In North Africa in 1942, we had some very, very serious setbacks. And Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1943, at Kasserine Pass, our guys ran the way the Union Army ran early in the Civil War. It was not good. They could not write that explicitly, but they could give readers some sense that that particular day or campaign's fighting had not gone well.
So you write about 5 writers deal with the print, and only portions of it you deal with their interface with the radio, the Edward R. Murrows of the world.
Right.
Did the Edward R. Murrows have the same sense of censorship?
Yeah, they sure did. And Murrow himself was in London, but his guys, his famous boys, Eric Severide, who then later joined Cronkite as a commentator on CBS News, and others, they had serious censorship problems, and they got into serious trouble, and so did Andy Rooney on the day that we finally liberated Paris, August 25th, 1944, because they used facilities in Paris, radio facilities that had not been approved ahead of time, and they broadcast things that had not been approved by the censors. And they got into very, very deep trouble because of that.
So the same thing would hold for Edward R. Murrow, again, using him as the example, where he'd have his script, but it would have been approved before he could go live?
Yeah, literally it would sort of be worked on last minute because they would get flashes, wire service reports from the field in that particular day or week's fighting. And Murrow and his guys, Charles Collingwood and others in London, the great Howard K. Smith, who we'll be talking about tonight, would be editing and groveling, begging with the censors to be able to include more specific information.
Do you find there is a continuing curiosity on World War II, the personages of the Nazi perpetrators? Here we are going through the 70th anniversary.
Right.
Do you find that to be as you go around?
Yeah, I think there is great fascination with the sickness of Nazi Germany and with the awful people who surrounded Hitler. And we'll be talking about that tonight. And if you're not too bored, you can please come by the courthouse tonight at 7 o'clock as we talk about Robert Jackson's great role as prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials. But yes, there is continuing fascination. I think there, especially in the last generation, there has been appreciation for the amazing, the great generation, or in my case, my parents, in your cases, your grandparents and great-grandparents, and the sacrifices they made on our behalf.
Your most recent book is entitled Savage Will, which, I'll read this, brings to life a remarkable story of perseverance, heroism, and survival. The true tale of the American medics and nurses who endured 2 months in Nazi-occupied Albania, and the fearless citizens and Allied intelligence officers who risked all to save them. This book received critical acclaim.
Thank you, it did. And I sort of unearthed the story of Savage Will in researching Assignment to Hell. Hal Boyle, the AP columnist, was actually taken off the front lines in January of 1944 and sent down to Bari, Italy, and he had no idea why he was being sent to Bari. It was very hush-hush, strictly confidential, but he went to the dock in Bari, which is right on the Adriatic Sea, and watched as a very small vessel carried from Nazi-held Albania across the Adriatic 30 medics and nurses who had been trapped in enemy-held Albania for 2 months. Their plane got lost in a nasty storm over the Adriatic. The pilots kind of lost their bearings. The compass wasn't working right. The radio wasn't working right. They ended up just crash landing on the first spit of land they spotted, which ended up being Nazi-held Albania. They were very lucky because the plane crash landed. They all survived. And the first people, actually, the second group of people on the scene were not German soldiers or enemy combatants in any way, but were in fact members of the partisans, the great resistance. And the resistance guys, at incredible peril, basically hid them away from the Germans for 2 months. And amazingly enough, they all made it out safely. The reason we haven't heard about this episode until I wrote the book about it is that the partisans were communists. This was late in the war. We did not, the U.S. military and U.S. intelligence did not want to give the partisans and the communists, who were so closely allied to Stalin and Russia, too much credit. And they did not want to give the British intelligence agents on the ground, who were so instrumental in getting the medics and nurses out of Albania, too much credit. So it got caught up in one area, in the old sort of Cold War back and forth with the Soviet Union, and then the great sort of intramural jockeying that went on with our friends, the Brits, during the war.
These two books, Savage Will, Assignment to Hell, coupled with your two baseball books, all deal with nonfiction, which means a heck of a lot of research. If you had to advise these inquisitive students, because we have the top Warren High School students behind us here. I want you to know who you're talking to.
I absolutely believe that.
Yeah. And what would you advise them about how to take curiosity, intelligent curiosity, to another level, no matter what you do? What's kind of a lesson?
You live in an amazing age, the computer and digitization age. I was just at the Warren Library doing some research about an article I'm hoping to do later this year, and I had to go through the old microfilm machines. You guys have never done this, but Greg is smiling, Jeff, others smiling, because when you did a research paper in high school or college, you had to stick this thing in and thread it through, and then literally by hand crank your way through newspaper and magazines, articles, and other things. Now you have this amazing thing called Google. And all you need to do is use Google and other search engines and special databases, and instantly, in some cases, up will pop just about all the information you need. Doesn't mean that it's easy doing research. It just means it's a little bit easier for you. And I would just urge all of you to develop good reading habits. You hear this all the time, I'm sure, from your teachers and guidance counselors, but that first couple of weeks, freshman year, it's going to be a little shock to the system next fall when you get to college, because the reading requirements will be so much more intense than what you're used to. So this, spring and summer, be great for you to develop sort of better reading habits, and it wouldn't hurt for you to use the library here and use the library downtown, which is so beautiful and my favorite place in town, always has been.
There's a few of these books you might want to read as soon as possible. Because it is nonfiction, you're writing about individuals. Some of these people probably are still alive. Do you ever wonder what their reaction is going to be when they read their story or they read the family story?
Yeah, sure. And one of my great regrets is that Andy Rooney was alive, Greg, when I first started researching Assignment to Hell. And I wanted very much to show him my manuscript. But he was a stickler, and his son and his colleagues at CBS warned me not to show him anything that hadn't been thoroughly copy edited and thoroughly proofread. So he was in very good health throughout the whole process, but sadly in November of 2011, he took ill quite suddenly and was 92 years of age and was gone quite quickly. And it to this day really upsets me that I didn't get a chance to show him the book. He could not have been more helpful in the process, and he gave me the run of his personal files. He had, over the decades, collected an incredible amount of World War II memorabilia and photographs, and if you go through Assignment and look through the photo spread, you'll see about half the pictures are credited to Andy, and he was, as I said, a Stars and Stripes correspondent. He had been trained as a photographer early on by Stars and Stripes, and it was quite good. There's a picture of bomb-damaged St. Paul's Cathedral in that book that is quite remarkable, and it's to this day bothers me that Mr. Rooney didn't get a chance to take a look at the manuscript. His son Brian is a great World War II buff, has been extremely helpful. I mentioned Chip Cronkite, Walter's son. Chip and his sisters, Kathy and Nancy, were both extremely helpful to me, and in fact, I'm very honored. His dad, this will make you feel better about your own family. Walter, the Cronkites were as disorganized about their personal memorabilia as your family is about yours. And he was forever taking stuff out of his CBS files and putting them places, and then years later, when he needed them, not being able to find them. His wife, Betsy, had beautifully preserved all of the personal correspondence that Walter had written to her during the war. And not only descriptions of bombing campaigns and Operation Market Garden. If you ever watched the movie A Bridge Too Far, that's the great airborne and land invasion of Holland that Cronkite literally crash-landed into in September of 1944. Anyhow, he had written her these beautiful hundreds and hundreds of letters that she had magnificently preserved, and they had put away in a special little lockbox thing in a trunk, and then nobody could find it. Nobody could find the trunk. After Mr. Cronkite passed away in the summer of 2009, Chip, his son, was going through their home in Martha's Vineyard and found the trunk. And I was the first student of history to be given the chance to go through it. And it was an incredible treasure trove. And if you read Assignment, you'll see how much of the Assignment narrative really owes itself to Cronkite's personal correspondence.
Being from Warren, your book on Satchel, Dizzy, and Rapid Robert really connects back to another Warren, Pennsylvania person in the form of Bob Peterson.
It sure does. Bob Peterson, no relation, correct?
No relation.
Bob Peterson graduated with my mother in the high school class of 43, and like my dad, I think fibbed about his age, joined the Marines, and was an amazing combat veteran in the Pacific Theater. he had his whole life been fascinated with the Negro Leagues. He had been a very good sandlot catcher growing up in Warren in the 1930s and early 40s, good enough to play on the National Forge semi-pro team. Back then, semi-pro baseball was a very big deal in towns like Warren. And in the early spring and in the fall, after the regular season was over, major league players and great Negro Leaguers would come barnstorming through Warren, and Bob Peterson often was the catcher against these guys. And he caught against some amazing Negro Leaguers, the Homestead Grays, which was a great Pittsburgh-based Negro League team of the late 1930s and early 40s, had a player, probably one of the 5 greatest baseball players who ever lived, catcher named Josh Gibson. But since he was African American, he could not play in the big leagues and never did. But he hit a home run at Russell Field, which the old East Side Diamond, sort of if you go toward keep on going east from War Memorial Field, about another quarter of a mile, there used to be a fabulous baseball diamond there that minor league teams played in Warren in the old days. Honus Wagner, great Hall of Fame shortstop for the Pittsburgh Pirates, played in those diamonds in 1895. He played in the old Warren Iron and Oil League team in the year 1895, which, as you know, was our Warren's, anyone? Centennial year. We were founded in 1795. And we had a fabulous little entry in the Iron and Oil League that Honus Wagner played for, hit 377 that year. But the longest home run supposedly ever hit at the East Side Diamond was hit by the great Josh Diamond with Bob Peterson behind the plate calling the pitches. And that moment left a very indelible impression on Bob. And he became the pioneer Negro League historian. And it was his book, which came out, I believe, in 1970, called Only the Ball Was White, really sort of reignited interest in the old Negro Leagues. And between Bob Peterson's scholarship and the great Ted Williams Hall of Fame induction speech a few years earlier, where he called on the Hall of Fame to begin inducting the great black players, most of whom never got a chance to play in the big leagues, that is what really got interest going in the Negro Leagues. And it was much fun to research Negro League barnstorming in my second book.
Josh Gibson was deemed to be the Babe Ruth of the Negro League baseball. At the time, you wrote an article for the Times Observer on Babe Ruth.
I did. Greatest single moment in the history of this town, October 19th, 1921. Coach Jeff Pizzurro was there. He'll tell you all about it. Babe Ruth came barnstorming through Western New York and Pennsylvania after the Yankees were beaten by the New York Giants in that year's World Series. He was not supposed to be doing it. Back then, barnstorming was not only discouraged, it was officially illegal. The almost brand new commissioner of baseball, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, was so upset against Babe Ruth that he threatened him with huge fines and threatened to suspend him if he didn't immediately cease and desist from barnstorming. But Babe, being the defiant Babe he was, went ahead with it. He played the previous day, October 18th, 1921. He played in Celeron, New York, at a beautiful diamond right up against Chautauqua Lake. But the next day, it was like a holiday in Warren. Businesses got out early. Schools got out early. People couldn't wait for the great Bambino, Babe Ruth, to show up. He finally did. In fact, there's a wonderful story. The Warren High football team was practicing on the fields next to the baseball diamond as Babe and his entourage, which included the great Bob Musell, fabulous outfielder, New York Yankees of that era, showed up at the field. And you can imagine those kids trying to concentrate on practice when the greatest, he was more than just a great baseball player. It would be as if LeBron James and Taylor Swift or Justin Timberlake, maybe that's better. Justin Timberlake and LeBron James were somehow combined into the same persona. That's how big Babe Ruth was in 1921. Easily, at that point, the biggest figure in the history of American pop culture, and to this day is one of the most amazing figures, not only in sports, but in American popular culture. And he hit a home run that day. And as I said in the article, if you were lucky enough to be in right field and grab that baseball and got the Babe to sign it, and you kept it in mint condition, and it was your family, you wouldn't have to worry about tuition next year. So.
What's our timing?
That's the bell rings to dismiss them.
Are they dismissed?
So we're going to be, yeah, about 20.
Ladies and gentlemen, Tim Gay, thank you so much.
Thank you. If you can.